Nobody remembers the exact moment Chuck Norris stopped talking, but everyone in that arena remembers what happened right before. 1972, a packed martial arts tournament in Los Angeles. Chuck Norris, reigning karate champion, unbeatable, untouchable, standing in the ring with a belt over his shoulder, scanning the crowd. He locked eyes with one man sitting quietly in the fourth row, pointed straight at him, told him he wouldn't survive 10 seconds. The crowd laughed. Chuck Norris wasn't laughing, and within minutes, neither was anyone else. Los Angeles, 1972, the International Karate Championship, the biggest open martial arts tournament on the West Coast, held inside a converted convention hall near downtown, the kind of venue that smelled like floor wax and old sweat, no matter how many times they cleaned it. Metal folding chairs arranged in rows around a raised platform. No cage, no ropes, just a square mat elevated 3 feet off the ground, with judges' tables on 2 sides, and a crowd that stretched back into the shadows where the overhead lights couldn't reach. 2,000 people filled that space, maybe more. The fire marshal would have had a heart attack. Bodies pressed together, shoulder to shoulder, standing room only along the back walls and in the aisles between sections. The air conditioning had given up hours ago. Every breath tasted like heat and adrenaline. Fans waved tournament programs in front of their faces, doing nothing against the warmth radiating off 2,000 tightly packed bodies. This wasn't some weekend hobby event. This was the proving ground. The tournament where reputations were built, destroyed, and rebuilt in a single afternoon. Fighters came from across the country, across the world. Japanese karatekas with rigid discipline and devastating precision. Korean taekwondo specialists who could crack ribs with spinning kicks most people couldn't even see. Filipino stick fighters who moved like their hands were possessed. Judo practitioners built like refrigerators. Everyone had something to prove. Everyone believed they were the best. But only one man had actually proven it. Chuck Norris, 6-time consecutive undefeated professional karate champion. Not 5, not 4, and a controversial decision. 6 clean, undisputed titles in a row. In the world of competitive martial arts during the early 70s, that record was almost mythological. People didn't just respect Chuck Norris. They feared him. Opponents would withdraw from brackets when they saw his name. Entire divisions thinned out because nobody wanted to be the next highlight on his resume. He stood on the platform that night like he owned the building. Black jai, crisp and pressed, belt slung over one shoulder because he didn't need to wear it for anyone to know who he was. His physique was intimidating in a way that photographs from that era barely capture. Thick forearms, wide shoulders, a neck that seemed to merge directly into his traps without stopping. His hands were weapons that had been registered in the minds of every serious martial artist in the country, and his face carried that expression, the one that became iconic decades later. Stone calm with just enough edge behind the eyes to let you know he was always calculating, always measuring, always ready. The crowd worshipped him. When he moved across the platform, acknowledging the audience, people stood. Applause rolled through the convention hall in waves. He was the main attraction, the reason most of these people had bought tickets, the reason the promoters could charge premium prices for seats that were essentially folding chairs with cushions taped to them. Chuck had just finished dismantling his semi-final opponent, a talented fighter from New York, fast hands, good footwork, the kind of martial artist who would have been champion in any other era. Chuck dropped him in under 90 seconds. Clean technique, devastating timing, total control. The crowd had erupted. The New York fighter walked back to his corner with the expression of a man who had just realized the ocean was deeper than he thought. Now Chuck was between bouts, standing on the platform with a microphone the promoters had handed him. This was part of the show, part of the spectacle. Champions addressed the crowd, talked about their training, their philosophy, issued open challenges to keep the energy high and the audience engaged. It was theatre mixed with genuine competition, and Chuck played the role perfectly. He raised the microphone, voice carrying easy and confident across that sweltering hall. The words came out smooth, practiced, but authentic. And then he did something nobody expected. Instead of delivering the standard speech, he paused, lowered the microphone, and started scanning the audience. Slowly, deliberately, row by row, face by face, like he was looking for someone specific. 2,000 people held their breath without knowing why. Something was about to happen. Nobody knew what. Chuck's eyes moved through the crowd like a searchlight. Methodical, patient, first row, second row, third row. Faces blurred together. Fans, fighters, journalists, girlfriends dragged along for the evening. Old masters with weathered hands sitting stiff-backed and silent. None of them held his attention. He kept scanning. The crowd grew restless, confused. People whispered to each other. What's he doing? Who's he looking for? Is this part of the show? It wasn't part of the show. At least not the kind anyone had planned. Fourth row? Left side. That's where Chuck stopped. His eyes locked on a man sitting between two larger companions. A compact figure in a simple dark jacket, buttoned neatly. No logos, no flash. The man sat with a posture that was unusual for someone in a crowd. Upright but not rigid, relaxed but not slouching, like a cat resting on a windowsill, completely still but somehow giving the impression that explosive movement was always one heartbeat away. Chuck pointed, not a casual gesture. A full arm extension, index finger aimed like the barrel of a rifle directly at this man in the fourth row. The microphone came back up. You, right there, stand up. 2,000 heads turned simultaneously. The man in the dark jacket didn't flinch, didn't look around to see if Chuck meant someone else, didn't shrink into his seat the way most humans would when a 6-time undefeated champion singled them out from a stage. He just sat there, expression unchanged, like someone had asked him to pass the salt. The man next to him, a stocky Filipino with concerned eyes, leaned over and muttered something urgent. The words were too quiet for anyone else to hear, but the body language was unmistakable. Don't do it. Stay seated. This isn't worth it. The man in the dark jacket gave a slight shake of his head, almost imperceptible, the kind of response that communicated absolute certainty without wasting a single calorie of energy. Then he stood, and the crowd saw him clearly for the first time. Small, maybe 5'7", on a generous measurement. Slim build that looked almost fragile compared to the heavyweight fighters who had been crashing into each other all evening. No visible bulk under that dark jacket. No cauliflower ears, no crooked nose, no visible markers of a fighting life. He looked like an engineering student who had accidentally wandered away from the university library and ended up at a martial arts tournament. The laughter started in the back rows and rippled forward. Not mean-spirited at first, more like nervous confusion. This was who Chuck Norris had picked out of 2,000 people. This narrow-shouldered man who probably weighed 140 pounds after a large meal. People nudged each other, grinning. Some shook their heads in something close to pity. A few of the professional fighters in attendance exchanged glances that said the same thing without words. Poor guy. Wrong place. Wrong time. Wrong decade. Chuck watched the man stand with an expression that was hard to read. Amusement, maybe. Confidence. Definitely. He'd picked this man for a reason, though whether that reason was random spectacle or something more deliberate, nobody in that arena could tell. "Come up here," Chuck said into the microphone. His voice carried absolute authority. Not aggressive, not threatening, just the calm command of a man who had never been told no inside a martial arts venue. "Let's see what you've got. I'll give you 10 seconds. 10 seconds on this platform with me. Think you can handle that?" The crowd loved it. Cheers, whistles, stomping feet that made the metal chairs rattle against the concrete floor. This was entertainment. A champion toying with a civilian. David and Goliath, except everyone knew Goliath was going to win because this wasn't a fairy tale. This was real life. And in real life, the bigger, stronger, more experienced fighter destroyed the smaller unknown every single time. The man in the dark jacket began moving toward the platform. He walked through the row of seats, excusing himself politely as he passed people's knees. No urgency, no hesitation. Each step measured and fluid, covering ground with an efficiency that only a handful of people in that arena would have recognized as significant. Most saw a small man walking to his embarrassment. A few, very few, saw something else entirely. Something that made them sit up straighter and stop laughing. The man reached the edge of the platform and paused. Not from hesitation, more like a driver checking mirrors before pulling onto a highway. One beat of stillness, then he stepped up. No stumble, no awkward climb, just a single smooth motion that brought him from floor level to the raised mat without any apparent effort. His shoes were off. Nobody saw him remove them. They were placed neatly at the base of the platform like he had done this 1,000 times before. Under the overhead lights, the contrast between the two men became almost comical. Chuck Norris filled space the way a mountain fills a valley. Broad, dense, radiating physical authority from every angle. His black GI stretched across his chest and shoulders like it was struggling to contain what was underneath. Beside him, the smaller man looked like a shadow that had accidentally detached from its owner and wandered into the wrong scene. Dark jacket, dark slacks, no fighting attire whatsoever. Street clothes, office clothes, the kind of outfit you would wear to dinner, not to a martial arts platform. The promoter rushed over, whispered something to Chuck, concern on his face, liability calculations running behind his eyes. What if this random audience member gets hurt? What if he sues? What if this looks bad on camera? Chuck waved him off with one hand without breaking eye contact with the smaller man. The promoter retreated, wringing his hands, already rehearsing apologies he hoped he wouldn't need. Chuck addressed the crowd again. 10 seconds, ladies and gentlemen. Our brave volunteer gets 10 seconds on this platform with the champion. Let's give him a round of applause for his courage. The emphasis on courage carried just enough edge to function as a prediction. Courage was all this man was going to have. It wouldn't be enough. The applause came, loud and tinged with anticipation. People in the front rows leaned forward. Cameras appeared from bags and pockets. Journalists who had been half asleep during the earlier bouts suddenly had their pens moving. This was the moment, the unexpected spectacle that would make the evening memorable regardless of what happened in the actual championship finals. A referee stepped onto the platform. Older gentleman, decades of tournament experience etched into the lines on his face. He positioned himself between the two men, looked at Chuck, looked at the volunteer, and recognized immediately that this situation was unusual. Standard protocol didn't cover champions pulling spectators out of the audience. He improvised, leaned toward the smaller man, spoke quietly. "Sir, this is light contact only, exhibition rules. The champion will demonstrate technique. You are free to defend yourself, but nobody is trying to hurt anyone. Do you understand?" The smaller man nodded once, calm, present. His eyes hadn't left Chuck Norris since he stepped onto the platform, not staring with aggression, not freezing with fear, observing, processing, reading the champion the way a musician reads sheet music, absorbing information that most people didn't even know was available. Chuck noticed. Something about the way this man held himself had shifted the atmosphere on the platform by a fraction of a degree. Not enough for the crowd to detect, but Chuck had spent 15 years in martial arts, had trained with masters in Korea, had fought in military competitions, had faced the best fighters on the planet. His instincts were tuned to frequencies that ordinary people couldn't access, and those instincts were sending a signal he hadn't expected. Not danger exactly, more like depth, like looking into water that appeared shallow from the bank but dropped into darkness the moment you waded in. He dismissed the feeling. 16 years of competitive fighting, 6 consecutive championships, a record that most martial artists couldn't approach in their wildest fantasies. Whatever this small man had, it wasn't going to matter in 10 seconds on a platform against the most decorated karate champion in the Western Hemisphere. Chuck settled into his fighting stance, left foot forward, weight distributed with the precision of an engineer, hands positioned at exactly the angles that 15 years of refinement had determined were optimal, every joint aligned, every muscle primed. He looked like a textbook illustration come to life, the physical embodiment of everything competitive karate aspired to be. The referee raised his hand. The crowd fell silent. 2,000 people holding breath they didn't realize they were holding. The hand dropped. 10 seconds began. Chuck moved first. Of course he did. Champions initiate. Champions dictate. That was the fundamental principle of his fighting philosophy, drilled into him through years of competition and reinforced by 6 championship belts. You don't wait. You don't react. You impose your will on the other person and force them to operate inside your framework. Every opponent he had ever faced had been forced to play his game. This small man would be no different. He launched a front kick. Fast, technical, the kind of strike that had folded dozens of opponents at tournaments across the country. His leg moved with mechanical precision, hips rotating to generate maximum force, foot driving forward on a straight line toward the smaller man's midsection. Perfect form, perfect timing. The kind of technique you could freeze frame and put in a martial arts instructional manual. It hit nothing. The smaller man wasn't where he had been a half-second earlier. He had shifted, not jumped, not scrambled, not stumbled backward the way untrained people do when violence comes toward them. He had simply adjusted his position by what looked like 6 inches, maybe less. The absolute minimum distance required to make Chuck's kick slice through empty air instead of connecting with a human torso. Chuck reset instantly, recalibrated, threw a reverse punch, his signature technique, the weapon that had ended more fights than any other tool in his arsenal. His fist rocketed forward with the accumulated power of 15 years of training, fast enough that most fighters only registered it as a blur before impact. The smaller man's head moved, tilted laterally by perhaps 2 inches. The punch passed so close to his jaw that Chuck felt the fabric of the man's collar brush against his knuckles. Miss. Clean miss. Not because the technique was flawed, because the target had relocated itself with a precision that bordered on precognition. 3 seconds gone. Chuck had thrown 2 of his best techniques and connected with nothing but air. The crowd hadn't processed this yet. Everything was happening too fast for untrained eyes to analyze in real time. They saw movement, saw Chuck attacking, assumed contact was being made. Only the experienced fighters in the audience understood what was actually happening, and they were leaning forward in their seats with expressions that ranged from disbelief to something approaching reverence. Chuck adjusted his strategy, closed distance through a combination that had never failed him in competition. Jab to draw the guard, cross to the body, roundhouse kick to the thigh. 3 strikes delivered in under a second, flowing together like a rehearsed sequence, each technique setting up the next in a chain of violence that had dismantled every style he had ever encountered. The smaller man dealt with all 3, not by blocking. Blocking would have been conventional, expected, something Chuck could work with and adapt to. Instead, the man redirected. His hand met the jab and guided it past his center line. His forearm intercepted the cross and turned it away like a matador turning a bull. And the roundhouse kick to the thigh found nothing, because the man's lead leg had simply withdrawn, pulled back at the exact moment the kick would have arrived, then replaced itself on the ground as if it had never moved. 5 seconds, half the promised time gone. Chuck Norris, 6-time undefeated champion, had not landed a single clean strike. Not one. His breathing was controlled but elevated, not from exhaustion, from something he hadn't experienced in years. Confusion. His techniques were perfect. His timing was impeccable. His speed was at championship level. None of it mattered. Every attack he launched was answered with the smallest possible adjustment, the most economical response, as though this man had studied Chuck's fighting style for months and prepared a counter for every weapon in his arsenal. But that was impossible. This was a random audience member, a volunteer, a man pulled from the 4th row wearing street clothes and dress shoes that were now sitting at the base of the platform. Nobody prepares for something they don't know is coming, which meant this wasn't preparation. This was something else, something deeper, an ability to read movement, to process intent, to understand the architecture of an attack in the fraction of a second between its initiation and its arrival. Chuck had never encountered anything like it. Not in competition, not in training, not anywhere. The crowd was beginning to notice. The cheering had thinned, replaced by a murmur that spread through the arena like wind through tall grass. 7 seconds in. Chuck changed everything, abandoned combinations, abandoned strategy, went purely instinctive, reaching into the place where 15 years of muscle memory lived, where thought dissolved and the body simply acted on its own accumulated wisdom. He feinted low, shifted his weight, and exploded with a spinning back kick, his most devastating technique, the one he saved for championship rounds when he needed to end things permanently. The kick that had sent a 200-pound Korean black belt to the hospital in 1969, the kick that fight commentators described as unsurvivable. His heel carved through the air in a tight arc aimed at the smaller man's rib cage. The rotational force behind it could crack concrete. This was not exhibition contact. This was reflex. This was a champion's body responding to an unfamiliar threat with maximum force because the conscious mind had stepped aside and let the animal take over. The smaller man did something no one in that arena had ever witnessed. He stepped forward, into the kick, not away from it, toward it. His timing was so precise that he entered the space between Chuck's body and the extending leg during the fraction of a second when the kick had committed its trajectory but hadn't yet reached full extension. The kill zone of the technique passed behind him because he was already inside it, already occupying the space where physics said a human being should not be able to exist during a spinning back kick. And then his hand rose, open palm, not a fist, not a strike. An open hand that came to rest against Chuck's chest, directly over the sternum, fingers spread, pressure gentle. The touch of someone testing whether paint was dry, the touch of a friend getting your attention at a crowded party. Almost nothing, almost weightless. But the message it carried was absolute. The open palm said everything a knockout would have said, but louder. It said, "I am here." It said, "Your most powerful weapon cannot reach me." It said, if this hand were closed, if this palm were a fist, if I chose force over grace, this fight and your championship career would be over in this instant. Chuck felt the hand on his chest, and something inside him went cold. Not fear, recognition. The sudden, stomach-dropping recognition that he was standing on a platform with someone who operated on a level he didn't know existed. Someone who hadn't just avoided his attacks, but had deconstructed them in real time, understood their geometry, exploited their weaknesses, and responded with a precision that made 6 championship titles feel like participation trophies. 9 seconds. The referee was watching with his mouth slightly open. The promoter had stopped wringing his hands and was standing motionless near the edge of the platform. The journalists had stopped writing. Every camera in the building was pointed at the same spot. The smaller man withdrew his hand, stepped back, created distance, returned to a neutral posture that looked like standing still, but contained within it the potential for movement in any direction at any speed. He hadn't thrown a single offensive technique during the entire exchange, hadn't punched, kicked, elbowed, or struck in any way. Every action had been defensive, evasive, redirective, and yet he had dominated the encounter so completely that it felt like watching someone solve a math equation that the other person didn't even know existed. 10 seconds. The referee's count expired. The exhibition was over. The arena existed in a state of collective paralysis. 2,000 people who had come expecting to watch a champion toy with a helpless volunteer were now sitting in silence trying to reconcile what their eyes had reported with what their brains believed was possible. Chuck Norris, the most dominant karate competitor of his generation, had spent 10 seconds attacking a man half his size and had not made contact once. Not once. 10 seconds of the most refined striking technique in American martial arts history, and every single attack had been rendered meaningless by a man in slacks and a dark jacket. Chuck stood center platform, arms at his sides. His chest moved with controlled breathing. His expression had transformed from the confident authority of a reigning champion into something more complex, more layered. There was frustration in it. There was confusion. But underneath those surface emotions, visible only to those who knew how to look, there was something unexpected. Curiosity. Genuine, burning curiosity. Because Chuck Norris had just encountered a puzzle his 15 years of training had not prepared him to solve. The silence lasted 4 seconds. It felt like 40. Then Chuck did something that shocked the arena more than anything that had happened during those 10 seconds on the platform. He lowered his head. Not in defeat, not in shame, in acknowledgement. A slow, deliberate bow directed at the smaller man standing 5 feet away from him. The kind of bow that martial artists reserve for masters. The kind that carries weight, history, and a confession that words would only diminish. The crowd didn't know how to interpret it. Their champion, their undefeated 6-time title holder, was bowing to a stranger from the 4th row. Some people started clapping, uncertain, scattered applause that sounded more like a question than a celebration. Others remained frozen, still processing, still trying to construct a narrative that made sense out of what they had witnessed. Chuck straightened up, took the microphone from the referee's hand, and spoke. His voice had changed, The showmanship was gone. The performer had exited and left behind the martial artist, the student, the man who had dedicated his entire adult life to understanding combat, and who had just been shown that his understanding had boundaries he never suspected. "I owe this man an apology," Chuck said. The words landed on the arena like a cold glass of water thrown on a sleeping face. People blinked, shifted in their seats. "I brought him up here to make a point about my skill. He just made a different point about his." He turned to the smaller man, extended his hand. Not the formal bow of martial arts tradition this time, but the personal gesture of one human being reaching toward another with genuine respect. The smaller man took it. Firm grip, brief, eye contact that communicated a conversation's worth of meaning in a single glance. Chuck kept the microphone. "What's your name? Tell everyone here your name." The smaller man took the microphone. When he spoke, his voice was unhurried, softly accented, carrying the quiet resonance of someone who never needed volume to command a room. "Bruce Lee." Scattered recognition moved through sections of the crowd. A few people knew the name. Martial arts students who had heard rumors about a Chinese instructor in Los Angeles who was teaching a revolutionary approach to fighting. People connected to Hollywood who knew him from a television role or from word spreading through studio back channels. But for most of the 2,000 people in that building, the name registered as nothing more than another name. No fame attached to it yet, no legend surrounding it. Just 2 syllables spoken by a small man in dark clothes who had just made the impossible look effortless. Chuck leaned toward his own corner, grabbed a towel, wiped his face. Then he walked back to Bruce and asked a question that the microphone caught and broadcast to the entire arena. "What was that? What style? Because I have never seen anything like that, and I have seen everything." Bruce considered the question the way a writer considers a sentence, carefully, giving each word its proper weight before releasing it. "No style," he said. "That is the point. The moment you commit to one style, you create limitations. I don't want limitations, I want freedom." Chuck stared at him. The arena strained to hear. People in the back rows were standing, craning necks, shushing neighbors. This had stopped being an exhibition and had become something else entirely. A conversation between 2 martial artists that everyone sensed was more significant than any championship match on the evening's card. "No style," Chuck repeated, testing the concept like a man tasting an unfamiliar food, uncertain but intrigued. "You're saying everything I've built, every technique, every system, you're saying that's a cage?" Bruce shook his head slightly. "Not a cage, a foundation. But if you only stand on the foundation, you never build the house." He paused. "You are extraordinary at what you do. Your karate is as good as any I've ever seen. But karate is one room. The mansion has many rooms." Something shifted behind Chuck's eyes at that moment. Multiple witnesses described it later in interviews, in magazine articles, in conversations that continued for decades. It was the look of a man whose entire worldview had just been gently, respectfully rearranged. Not demolished, not mocked, rearranged. Like someone had walked into his mental house and opened windows he didn't know were there, letting in light and air from directions he had never considered. The 2 men talked for another 20 minutes after the cameras stopped rolling. Off the platform, away from the microphones, standing in a corner of the convention hall while the tournament continued without its champion. Chuck's cornermen kept glancing over, confused. The championship final was approaching. Their fighter was supposed to be preparing, warming up, reviewing strategy. Instead, he was deep in conversation with the man he had pulled from the audience as a prop for his showmanship. Nobody could hear what they discussed, but people who watched from a distance described the body language. Chuck listened more than he spoke, nodded frequently. At one point, Bruce demonstrated something with his hands, a small movement, a principle made visible through gesture rather than force. Chuck tried to replicate it, failed, tried again, got closer. Bruce adjusted his positioning with a touch so subtle it looked like a suggestion rather than a correction. Chuck tried a 3rd time. His eyes widened. Whatever he had just felt or understood hit him with visible impact. Dan Inosanto, who had been sitting next to Bruce in the 4th row, watched from across the hall with an expression that mixed amusement with inevitability. He had seen this happen before. had watched Bruce dismantle assumptions and rebuild them in real time with person after person. Boxers, wrestlers, fencers, military combatives instructors. They all arrived with certainty and left with questions. Good questions. The kind that made you better if you had the courage to sit with them, instead of running back to comfortable answers. Chuck won the championship final that night, defeated his opponent in under 2 minutes with the same devastating technique that had carried him through 6 consecutive titles. The crowd roared, the belt was presented, photographs were taken. The evening ended the way the promoters had planned, with their champion standing victorious under the lights. But Chuck later described that final match as the least significant event of his entire evening. The 10 seconds on the platform with Bruce Lee had fundamentally altered the trajectory of his martial arts journey. Within weeks, he began visiting Bruce at his school in Los Angeles, not as a champion coming to evaluate, as a student coming to learn. He brought his ego to the door and left it outside like muddy shoes. Their training sessions became legendary within the small community of martial artists who knew about them. Chuck would demonstrate his championship karate, the techniques that had made him untouchable in competition. Bruce would examine them the way a jeweler examines a diamond, appreciating the craftsmanship while simultaneously identifying facets that could be refined, angles that could be improved, dimensions that Chuck had never explored because his system didn't acknowledge their existence. In return, Bruce absorbed Chuck's understanding of competitive fighting, the psychology of tournament combat, the strategic thinking that separated champions from contenders. Their exchange was mutual. Neither man positioned himself as purely teacher or purely student. They were 2 rivers meeting, each carrying different minerals, each enriched by the convergence. Years later, when Bruce was casting for his film Return of the Dragon, he needed an opponent for the climactic fight scene. Someone who could project genuine danger on screen. Someone the audience would believe could actually threaten Bruce Lee. He chose Chuck Norris. Not despite what happened on that platform in Los Angeles, but because of it. Because Chuck had demonstrated something that night that went beyond technique or titles. He had demonstrated the ability to recognize superior skill without letting his ego collapse. He had demonstrated humility in its purest form, the willingness to learn from someone who had just exposed his limitations in front of 2,000 strangers. That Colosseum fight scene in Rome became one of the most iconic martial arts sequences ever filmed. 2 men who respected each other deeply, creating art from combat, translating a private understanding into something millions of people would watch and feel without ever knowing its origin. The 10 seconds on the platform were never televised. No footage survives. The moment exists only in the memories of those who were present and in the interviews and writings that emerged over the following decades. But its impact echoed through both men's careers, through the evolution of martial arts in America, through every moment when a champion chose curiosity over defensiveness and discovered that losing 10 seconds could mean gaining a lifetime of understanding. Chuck Norris pointed at Bruce Lee expecting a punchline. Instead, he found a teacher, and he was wise enough to recognize the difference.